Sunshine and Shadows is the perfect visual of what really occurs in one's life, and this was the name Robert Fairbanks Darling gave his autobiography. He was the son of early pioneers George E. and Nellie Darling, who moved to Morris in 1878. George was an attorney and also owned land in Framness Township. George held positions in the town of Morris as village justice, village attorney, and judge of probate. Nellie and George had 6 sons and 2 daughters. The house they owned was located on East 8th Street in Morris. Robert was the youngest of the 6 sons, with one sister, Margaret, younger. The Darlings were well established by the time he was born in July of 1893. Robert and Margaret spent a great deal of time adventuring in the prairie space between their home and the railroad tracks, where there was a wonderful ditch full of tadpoles and other critters. They would take a rest on the big front porch with the grown-ups, and then off they would go again. Most of the chores during Robert's younger years fell onto his older brothers to fulfill. One such chore was the moving of the pigs from one pen to the next, when it was time to clean the pens. Most town residents had barns on their property, with animals to provide necessities. Pigs can be fast runners. That particular day they were very fast, and took off for a tour of other homes in Morris. 2 of the Darling boys were in full pursuit. To their dismay, and the greater dismay of a dozen lovely ladies enjoying a garden party 2 blocks away, the pigs charged right through the lawn and the party. As in all small towns, this was much talked about for some time, and it certainly was discussed around the Darlings' dinner table. The family spent summers in several tents on the shores of Lake Minnewaska in neighboring Pope County. George would drive his fast horses, Rex and Speeder, out on Saturday afternoon and return Monday to work. During the school year, the family was back in Morris, where the children attended Longfellow School. Robert was an exceptional reader and very good in English, perhaps due to the emphasis put on books by his parents. George was so keen on reading that he became a key stakeholder in the efforts to acquire funds to build a Carnegie Library, which was completed in September of 1905, 1 month too late for George to enjoy. Robert's life changed in the summer of that year when he was just 12. He went to the farm to help stack hay with his brother and father on a hot August day. By late afternoon, Robert's father, George, had succumbed to a heart attack and died. His funeral was remembered by Robert as a huge event, with mourners extending a whole mile from their home to the cemetery. The years that followed were not to be easy. By 1910, Nellie moved her family to Minneapolis. Robert started his school year in Minneapolis and was plain miserable. Arrangements were made, and he came back to finish his education at Morris. His junior year in 1910 was his highlight year. He was captain of the ball team, had a lead role in the class play, and helped publish the first yearbook of the Morris School, called The Comet. His very best friend was Olaf Satter. Many fun times were held at the Satter farm home, 3 miles east of Morris. One of the 7 Satter daughters was a beauty named Rebecca. She was 2 years behind him in school. A fast friendship was forming between Rebecca and Robert. Robert, who was on his own, needed work. There followed a series of efforts to make his own way. He worked on the railroad, drove wagons, plucked turkeys and chickens, and hired to do farm work in Horton Township. Thinking that perhaps his success was in obtaining his own land, he spent 2 summers in Montana, where he filed the dryland claim. While living there, he contracted typhoid fever and returned to Morris. By the time he recovered, his claim had been jumped, and his pockets were empty. Following Rebecca's graduation in 1913, she engaged in her chosen career. By 1917, she was beginning her third year of teaching in country schools. Robert Darling was taking care of the Satter farm, and so Robert and Rebecca's time came for them to dream new dreams and make new plans, all depending on World War I. Robert had already been registered as a recruit, and his call to service came. He left on June 24, 1918, from the Morris Depot. He trained at Camp Grant in Rockford, Illinois. The couple wrote each other, and Bob kept a journal. Both engaged in the war efforts in their own ways. Rebecca Satter was a school teacher, a Red Cross worker of considerable status, and the girl back home for Robert F. Darling. Becky had sent a diary along with Robert in which she had written,
"God be with you till we meet again."
He was assigned to a horse battalion ammunition train in France. Rebecca knit him a sweater that she sent along with dozens of pairs of socks. It followed him around and finally was returned to her as it couldn't be delivered. When he returned, it became one of his most precious possessions, and he wore it for years following the war. His travel to the front story was an example of how soldiers were getting killed getting there. His ship, the Rhesus, was one of a convoy of 11. It ran into bad weather and was in the center of a storm. A collision occurred where the Kashmir sailed into the bow of another ship and cut it in two. 481 lost their lives, mostly soldiers on their way to the war. Thus began Robert's service duty until his return home in February of 1919. From the train station in Morris, he walked out to the farm in Framness Township and surprised Rebecca. They became officially engaged that night. By the next year, November 25, 1920, children of two of the earliest pioneer families in Stevens County were married. A beautiful Thanksgiving Day wedding united Rebecca Satter, daughter of Norwegian immigrants, Andrew and Dorothea, with Robert Darling, son of early pioneers George and Nellie, of English descent. Leaving for their honeymoon, they almost missed the midnight train as it was starting to move towards the Twin Cities. Best man and brother Harry jumped on the train and stopped it. The couple returned to the farm named Satter Hill and continued to care for the acres and animals. They lived in the dorms of the farm home, a space the Satters had built for extra help. Their first daughter, pre-named John, was born on August 15, 1921. The baby girl was named Dorothy Jean. Rebecca inherited her share of the Satter estate about a month later when her father Andrew passed away. The couple built a home across the road from Satter Hill on land that became known as the 80. In 1926, a second baby was due, pre-named John, who arrived as Ruth Adele. In 1935, baby number 3 surely would be a John, but arrived as a beautiful blue-eyed girl who they named Donna Marie. The years 1920 through 1936 were tough years. The county was in a depression, not helped by a 2-year drought known as the Dust Bowl. Bob found some extra work hauling gravel and was involved in some of the Works Progress Administration jobs, WPA. One of the local projects was building District 14 stone schoolhouse 1/2 mile away from the Darling 80. Stones for the project came off the farms of the neighborhood, and the very farmers who picked the stone also helped to build the school. The Morris Post Office, dedicated in 1938, was an example of the federal government providing funds for building. This surge was to help communities and get the economy moving again. The town gathered in celebration of this building dedication in March of 1938. In 2015, the same post office building remains. Robert was a tree planter, specializing in shelter belts. In seeking additional employment during those lean years, he began to work for the Home Builders Lumber Company, who wanted logging done on some of their properties and new trees planted. Soon they referred him to customers who wanted some help with carpentry. He found out help meant him building the whole house. This provided an opportunity for full-time employment with Home Builders Lumber Company in Morris. With the promise of steady income, the Darlings decided to give up farming. Bob worked for the lumber company for 19 years and then 2 more years with Lampert Lumber until he retired in 1958. The security of consistent income provided opportunity. Desiring the conveniences of running water and electricity that town life offered, they made plans to build a home in Morris, completed in 1940. They still owned the farmland, but were now living in town. 5 years after the new home was built, the Darlings were debt-free for the first time in 25 years. The new home featured an English cottage look with a sunken backyard. Becky was the flower gardener, and Bob was the tree planter. All 3 of the daughters attended Morris High School. Dorothy graduated in 1939, Ruth in 1943, and Donna in 1953. All 3 of the girls were married. Rebecca, who was a talented seamstress, designed and sewed dresses for the brides, attendants, and the flower girl. Dorothy married Richard Wagner in June of 1947. Donna married Richard Swenson in September 1956. Ruth was married in November 1958 to Merlin Jensen. From these unions, the Darlings had 6 grandchildren, 5 boys and 1 girl, and the first grandson was named John. Rebecca was talented and had learned many skills from her mother, Dorothea. Much of her free time was spent in creative pursuit. She sewed, painted, carved, arranged flowers, knit, and tooled copper. Her backyard was an Eden of flowers. She never missed the annual event on the campus at West Central School of Agriculture, known as the Homemakers' Workshop. This retreat each summer provided rural women with an opportunity to learn while enjoying fellowship with each other. The Satters, as early pioneers, had been charter members of the First Lutheran Church, while the Darlings were Congregationalist and Methodist members. Rebecca and Robert maintained membership at First Lutheran for life. All 3 of their daughters were married at First Lutheran. 3 grandchildren were baptized, confirmed, and married there. Both funeral services were at First Lutheran, Robert in January 1971 and Rebecca December 1983. Robert retired from work in 1958 and soon became the actuary of Summit Cemetery. He kept the records of the gravesites. His books, which covered the period of 1958 to 1970, were later donated to the Stevens County Museum and are filled with many historical notations in the margins of the recorded names. He was a good historian of the facts. He was also a great storyteller. After retirement, he made daily trips to the farm where daughter Dorothy was now living. The grandchildren recall hours spent in the car with Grandpa Bob spinning tales about Billy Goat Gruff and Old Brer Rabbit and Old Brer Fox. In 1959, Robert, who had been a tree man all his life, was doing some maintenance pruning under the power lines in his backyard. The latter was on slippery, frozen ground. In his own words, "I was shown in one easy lesson how to be disabled for the rest of my life." He suffered a broken hip that didn't heal correctly. He ended up with a 2-inch difference in his legs. He fashioned his own built-up shoe sole and extraordinary hand-carved diamond willow canes. These canes were a personal statement of Bob Darling. Robert and Rebecca celebrated 50 years of marriage in November of 1970. They were the children of families who were pioneers in Stevens County, looking for a better life, real opportunity, and a chance to build a new part of the nation. Robert and Rebecca were the generation that was active in World War I and saw their own children be a part of World War II. They lived through 2 world wars, a depression and dust bowl, mortgages that seemed to never end, and emerged victors. Their lives, as all lives are, were a mixture of sunshine and shadows, just like the story written by Robert Darling himself.